This week on the show, we have OpenBSD 6.2 available now. There are style arguments we're going to cover. And there's the second round of viewer interview questions from you, the audience. We also show you how to set the CPU affinity for FreeBSD jails and cover containers on FreeNAS in this week's episode of BSD Now. BSD Now, episode 217, Your Questions, Part 2, recorded for the 25th of October 2017. Hi, I'm your host, Benedikt Reuschling.
And I'm Alan Jude.
And we have yet another great episode prepared for you. So this is right into the headlines for this week. OpenBSD 6.2 has been released.
Yep. So OpenBSD continues their 6-month release cadence with the release of 6.2, which is the 44th release of OpenBSD. On a slightly disappointing note, apparently the song will not come out until December.
Huh. Oh, well, it's still good to have a song for each release.
I wonder if that means it's a Christmas song.
That could very well be, yeah.
Because it seems an odd amount of delay and rather specific. So it seems like maybe it's a Christmas song. I don't know. But there's quite a bit that's new in 6.2, but some highlights. Improved hardware support on modern platforms, including ARM64 and ARM v7, as well as Octeon. And in addition, AMD 64 users will appreciate the additional support of the Intel Kaby Lake video cards for Intel. The network stack improvements continue as they've done extensive SMPization improvements, as well as the new FQ Codel queuing discipline, which is meant to be more fair and avoid buffer bloat, as well as enhanced Wi-Fi support in general and improvements specifically to the IWN, IWM, and AthN drivers. There's improvements to VMM and VMD, which is the OpenBSD native virtualization platform. Security enhancements to the libc with the new free zero function, which overwrites memory with zeros when it frees it so that it can't accidentally be reused and there's no unintended data left laying around in physical memory, as well as further pledging of the base system programs and conversions of several daemons to the new fork and exec model. General security features, they've added the trap sleds with their changes to the compiler, Carl, the kernel address randomization, or kernel something, randomized something.
I know
where they relink the kernel between every boot so that the kernel is not the same every time. They've also added random linking to libcrypto and ld.so, and dramatically increased security by making it harder to find helpful ROP gadgets and by creating a unique order of objects on every reboot. They've extended that to the installer, so the installer will relink the kernel when it installs it, so your very first boot will be unique as well. And they've also switched the base system compiler for AMD 64 and i386 to be Clang, after they imported Clang for ARM64 support. They've also built in new versions of OpenSSH, OpenSMTPD, LabelSSL, and Mandoc. The kernel no longer handles IPv6 stateless address auto-configuration, or SLAC, which allowed the cleanup and simplification of the IPv6 network stack. They've improved the IPv6 checks for the IPsec policies and made them consistent with the IPv4 versions. And they've enabled the use of per CPU caches for the network packet allocator to again better take advantage of multiple CPUs. They've also improved the UTF-8 line editing support in KSH, the default shell on OpenBSD, and added Emacs and VI input modes. So whatever editor you're used to, you can use those on your command line. One breaking change to watch out for, if you're booting from an NVMe device, with a GPT disk layout, which I don't know that you would do something other than GPT on an NVMe, but anyway, you are affected by an off by 1 error in the driver as you switch from 6.1 to 6.2, with the consequence that the sector count in your partition table may be incorrect. The only way to fix this is to reinitialize the partition table, back up your data to another disk before you upgrade, and in the new bsd.rd, drop to a shell and rebuild the GPT table, and they provide the command to do that.
Oh, okay.
So that one's a little unfortunate, but
there's
anyway, there are instructions for updating on the website. As usual, there's more of a reinstall than an upgrade in place, but that's the way OpenBSD likes it.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the release notes have a lot more information about all the utilities that got changed or updated. So check out the full release notes that we've linked in the show notes. And check out the new release of OpenBSD. Next up, we have a story called Why We Argue. And that's specifically about style. And it goes, I've been thinking about why we argue about code and how we might transform vehement differences of opinion into active forces for good. My thoughts spring from a very specific context. 10 or 12 times a year, I go to an arbitrary business and spend 3 or more days teaching a course in object-oriented design. I'm an outsider, but for a few days, these businesses let me in on their secrets. Here's what I've noticed. In some places, folks are generally happy. Programmers get along. They feel as if they are all in this together. As businesses like this, he spends most of his time actually teaching object-oriented design. Other places, folks are surprisingly miserable. There's a lot of discord and programmers have devolved into competing camps. In these situations, the course rapidly morphs away from OO design into a wide-ranging group discussions about how to resolve deeply embedded conflicts. Tolstoy famously said that happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. This is known as the Anna Karenina principle, and there's a link here to Wikipedia if you want to know more about this, and describes situations in which success depends on meeting all of the number of criteria. The only way to be happy is to succeed at every one of them. Unhappiness, unfortunately, can be achieved by any combination of failure. Thus, all happy businesses are similar, but unhappy ones appear unique in their misery. Having now taught a fair number of classes, I've experienced various unhappy shops and I'm beginning to discern some common criteria for happiness. In this newsletter, I discuss one of them, which more to follow in future newsletters. So there's a newsletter. You can sign up at the beginning of this blog post, so if you're interested in future updates for this. But today I'm interested in choices of syntax, like whether or not your shop has agreed upon and follow a style guide. If you're surprised that I'm starting with this apparently mundane issue, consider yourself lucky if your choice of workplace. And if you're shaking your head in rueful agreement about the importance of this topic, I feel your pain.
And that's the main reason why I picked this story to cover, is because it's often a question, especially with newer people that are interested in contributing a patch or whatever, is why are these people harping on me about, laying it out in their style? It's like, it doesn't make that big of a difference, does it? Well, it turns out it does.
Yeah. So the first question comes, why have a style guide? So I firmly believe that all of the code that I personally have to examine should come to me in a consistent format. Code is read many more times than it is written, which means that the ultimate cost of code is in its reading. It therefore follows the code that should be optimized for readability, which in turn dictates that an application's code should all follow the same style. Adhering to a common style saves you money. So the question ultimately comes to what style is best. Most programmers agree with the prior paragraph, but here's where things break or begin to break down. As far as I'm concerned, my personal formatting style is clearly the best. However, I'm quite sure that you feel the same. It's easy for a group of programmers to agree that all code should follow a common style, but surprisingly difficult to get them to agree on just what that common style should be. The truth is, many stylistic choices are arbitrary and purely a matter of personal preferences. choosing a style guide means building agreements in areas where we have strong differences of opinion about issues of little significance. It's not style that matters, but sameness of style. So why can't teams agree?
Well, we don't want to read the whole thing.
No.
But anyway, I've said, one of the main points they make in this is that you want to avoid appointing a human style cop. Although we kind of have this a little bit in FreeBSD, but special.
Well,
anyway,
a few.
That's historical reasons, or hysterical reasons. Anyway, you don't want to have a style cop which just forces someone into an increasingly ill-tempered nag. Instead, supply programmers with the information they need to remedy their own transgressions. By the time a pull request is submitted, misstyling should long have been put right. Pull request conversations ought to be about what code does rather than how it looks. Right? We want to get the code in a good state, and then we can reformat it to be in the right style. The initial review you get as, when you're a new contributor trying your first patch to FreeBSD, you want the feedback to be about what your code does, not how your code looks. We can fix the style after.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's it's even more difficult if you have multiple people from different cultures in open source, all contributing to the same source material.
Well, also, even the style guide for FreeBSD changes over time.
And it's not set in stone. Yeah.
We'll talk about it a little bit more in a bit, but you don't go rewriting old code just to restyle it. And so even with the different styles, we end up with, or even with the style guide, we end up with slightly different styles in a number of places. And then we have things like we import OpenZFS, and we're not going to go restyle all that code because it's going to make importing the next version that much more difficult. And so it can get more and more complicated. I think one of the most important headlines in the article right here is, don't I deserve to have my own way? And the answer is, well, no. It's common to see a group of programmers who came from another language trying to use that language's style and so on can cause problems. But and they get into how to reach a consensus on a style guide, but that's not really important to us here. But then they get to the question, what about code that already exists? And the answer there is ignore it. You don't have to restyle all existing code. Just do better from this day forward. Defer updating old code until you're touching that code for some other reason. Following this strategy means that your code will most often will gradually make into a common style. It also means that some of your existing code might not get updated, but if you never look at it, then it doesn't matter. If you choose to restyle code that you otherwise have no need to touch, you're declaring that changing the look of this old code has more value to your business or project than delivering the next item in the backlog. The opportunity cost of making a purely aesthetic change doesn't lose the benefit of, or means you are losing the benefit of what you could have been working on instead. The rule of thumb is, don't bother updating the style of stable existing code unless doing so is costing you money. In open source, it's even worse, though, because you want to avoid reformatting code because it's going to cause merge conflicts for people that have imported your code and made changes, or downstream projects and upstream projects and so on. If we went and restyled all of the ZFS code, that would only cause us more pain as we tried to import newer versions of ZFS. If we just rototill a bunch of code, then companies that build appliances on top of FreeBSD are going to have to deal with trying to separate the style changes from the code changes. And just avoiding the style changes if we can is usually better. And that's why the project can seem to be relatively strict about making sure the style is right before it goes in, because once it goes in, it can't change. And that's why we have to make sure we don't make unnecessary changes as well, because it just creates more work for everyone down the road.
Yeah. Style is important if you're all working on the same code base, but it has many different Yep. Things attached to it.
And then they have this last point. What if I hate the style guide? If you disagree with the style guide upon which your team agrees, you have only two honorable options. First, you can obey the guide despite your aversion. That's what you should do. And it's possible that if you follow the guide, eventually you'll begin to like it. Alternatively, you can decide that you will not obey the style guide. Making this decision depends on what you leave, demands that you leave your current position at the project and find some other project whose style guide matches your preferred style. And I don't think most programmers pick which projects to work on based on where they put the curly braces rather than what the code does.
That.
So basically the answer is suck it up and follow the style guide. Or there's no or, basically. But basically, if you decide not to follow the FreeBSD style guide, then you can go work on some other project and follow their style guide. Either way, you're going to follow the style guide. That's how it goes. Yeah, with either of these options, you follow the style guide. That part's not optional. The moral of the story, it's more important for all the code to be formatted the same than it is for any one person to get their way. Commit to agreeing upon and following the style guide. If you find that your team cannot come to an agreement, step away from this problem and start a discussion about the decision-making process and the power of the project and so on. There have been too many arguments about style, and it can often be one of the first complaints new people have about an open source project. It's like, I spent all this work writing this code and now you want me to reformat it. But if you're going to contribute to open source, you might want to look at the style of the existing code and the style guide and make sure you're following that when you write the patch in the first place to avoid some of that. But I felt this article kind of covered it from both sides of A, you should follow the style guide of the project you're contributing to, but B, the project should review your actual code and then comment on the style in the second pass. And also, rather than being a style cop about it, gentle guidance towards the right style so that it's more of a suggestion. Well, it's a requirement, but that you're recommending how to solve the problem rather than just telling them, please go solve this problem.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's also a more strict way of Jenkins or other continuous integration tools that check for the style guide and will refuse a commit that's not meeting the style guide. This might be
right. And then I think Go even has an auto formatter where they just decided on a format and they have tools that just reflow your code no matter how you write it into the final thing. Sometimes the code seems a little too complicated for that to make sense, but
yeah, it's not an easy issue to deal with, but still it's important to have. Okay, yeah, check out the full article and maybe provide some feedback in the comment section or write about us or write at this feedback at bsdnow.tv. I can't even get our email address right today.
It's getting to be a long day.
Yeah.
This episode of BSD Now is brought to you by IXsystems. Head over to IXsystems.com/BSDNow and get in touch with them for your next project. For me, that was a bunch more video encoders, but also I needed more storage. So a storage server I had bought from IX previously now needed more room. All of the existing 24 hard drives were full. I needed more space. So they gave me a couple of options depending on how much more space I wanted to add. And I chose to go with a new 44 drive storage array. So this, unlike my original thing, which was actually a server with a bunch of hard drive bays in it, this is a JBOD. Basically, it looks like a server, but there's no motherboard or anything in it. Just a power supplies, the adapters, and a couple of other components and fans. And you fill both sides of it with hard drives. And then external SAS cables, plug it back into the existing server. IX even had pictures of the original server right? I give them the serial number, and they had pictures of it to show, all right, we'll ship you a card that you put in this slot in the existing server, and then you run the cables we'll send you into this new thing. And we had the option of, we didn't completely fill all 44 hard drive slots at the beginning, so we're going to just fill some of them for now, and then in the future we can add some more, and maybe by then the price per gigabyte will mean that we buy bigger hard drives then. And we can just keep filling those sleds over time, and if we do manage to fill all 44 drive slots eventually, we could just add another one. And just, they made it super easy, and probably by the time this episode airs, the pallet with that will have arrived and we'll have it hooked up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so the IXsystems guys can help you with, from the original idea, I want to solve this, or the server purpose should be doing that, to does this hardware work with the other component I'm building in there, or is there something more performant or cheaper with the same performance? So yeah, there's many things that IX can tell you, and their engineers will be happy to answer your questions.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of different questions that can come up, and really the key to getting the most out of IX is giving them the details of what the project you're doing and what it is you're trying to accomplish, what the goals are, and what the minimum level of performance you need is. And they can design for that so that even in the worst case, you get that much performance. But in most cases, you end up getting more than that so that your system can perform. You know, when you're comparing shopping, everybody's list, oh, this can do up to this many IOPS. It's like, yeah, but when everything's, in worst possible case of random IO and so on, what's the minimum level of IOPS it can guarantee? And that's what you actually need to build something with. So get in touch with IX and ask them about the entire line of different Intel processors you can use to build your server, whether you want a low-power Atom in a FreeNAS Mini for under your desk, or a little short-depth machine to be a router or a firewall or whatever, or if you're like me and you need a 4U machine with 36 hard drives with additional shelves of extra hard drives to stack on top of it. They can do the entire thing, you know, whether you need one small machine or one big machine, or in my case, I need 10 more small, high-end but relatively small machines, and I need them, each one of them shipped to a different data center, spread across 2 different countries. And yeah, I need it all done like ASAP. And they're like, okay.
Yeah, sure. And the ports labeled and which cable should go into which slot.
Exactly. It's just all the white glove stuff that means that I know that it'll just get there and everything will be fine. And I won't have to worry that around the date when these are going to get delivered, I'm going to be flying around to different places to go to conferences, and that we have a deadline we have to meet, and no worries at all, because IX will just make it happen. So get in touch with them, ask them what they can do for you, and tell them what it is you're trying to do, and they will make it happen.
So this is a segment many people have been looking forward to, the viewer interview questions part 2. We've done one a couple of episodes before, but there were more questions we could answer, so this is part 2, and we still have a bunch more which we couldn't cover in this one. So yeah, we'll have more of those.
Yes, and thank you for everyone for submitting these, because there's only so much news in a week, and when we have to record 2 episodes a week for a couple of weeks in a row, that really helps us have enough content, but also, people want to know the answers to these questions, and so this was a great way to do that.
Okay.
So I guess we'll get started right away. So the first question from a viewer was, which other BSDs besides FreeBSD would you participate and contribute to if you had time or interest?
So my reply is perhaps NetBSD, but I don't know. It's hard to tell. I've never considered any other BSD than FreeBSD. Although it's still compelling what the others are doing, it's just no time.
Yeah, for me, if there wasn't FreeBSD anymore or whatever, or if I had to work on something else, I think it would actually be something like Illumos. It's the upstream for dtrace and ZFS and a lot of other cool stuff, and just a lot of my type of people.
Yeah, and JT answers, one of the core hardened BSD developers, Sean Webb, of course, is in his local bug, so the BSD user group they have. So that's probably where I would land if I decided to depart from TrueOS. Since it's based on FreeBSD, it's not that far to go. However, most of my focus now is on desktop computing, so I'm not really sure how well that fit into the project. Beyond that, if we're talking about crazy ideas, I'd really like to see a mobile OS based on BSD, but mixed with a few tricks I learned while he was a Puppy Linux developer. He answers or writes, I'm really drawn to the idea of a stateless BSD-based OS on a phone.
That is interesting. Next question. What do you think are FreeBSD's weaknesses? There's a lot of talk about its strengths on the show for obvious reasons. And where do you see FreeBSD going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so in my opinion, FreeBSD's weakness is that it's underestimated by many people. They don't even consider it and just don't know why. Perhaps it's marketing, but everyone else is using Linux, so it must be good. I hear that a lot, also as my work in the foundation, but the people who leverage FreeBSD know its strengths and often have an advantage because they did not choose to go what mainstream does. So, of course, there are things left to do in FreeBSD, but guess what? That never ends, and other systems are not better off. They also have loose threads that they have to finish. Yeah, so it's just that there's a louder audience out there yelling to you that to choose the popular option. Think independently and decide what best suits your needs. So that's probably what I would answer to this. And seeing FreeBSD in the next 5 to 10 years, it's hard to tell, but I'm in a good position to be there when it's happened, and I can also influence it a little bit in my own kind of way. So there's a bright future ahead, that's for sure.
But no real ideas about where that might go?
Well, certainly we'll make more collaboration with other projects, like our good developer relations we have with the Illumos folks or the other BSDs, even though there's still some back and forth. But all in all, we're all a big BSD family, and I think that's going to still be the way in 5 to 10 years. And technically, there's new platforms coming out. There's new technology happening. Certainly, the all things that you now take for granted, like if you switch off the computer, all the RAM is gone. This might not be the case in the next 5 years. So the persistent memory is something that we need to figure out, and it's also something that will change the mindset of how we work with computers. I mean, if resetting the computer just means power cycling it, this might not happen in the future. So debugging is a different issue then, because if you keeps the state of the memory between reboots, then debugging becomes much more complicated sometimes, but it's also more interesting because then tools like dtrace and other might be the thing that you need to look more for and be well versed in those. Mm-hmm. That's my take.
So for me, I think the biggest weakness for FreeBSD is that most people don't know that it exists. However, I will admit there are quite a number of different faults with BSD. A number of the defaults should probably be adjusted. I know the default argmax on ZFS is maybe a bit excessive. Now that it's runtime adjustable, that's a little bit less of an issue, but still. But in general, the out-of-the-box experience for new users could be vastly improved. I've slowly been working on that, but there's so much to be done, and there's kind of this trap that happens. As you continue to work on BSD more and more, you get further and further away from that first-time experience as a user. And it becomes hard to actually see the system the same way someone who's completely new to it does.
What they're struggling with.
Yeah. So, one of the experiments or projects or whatever I want to do for a while is get some people that aren't familiar with FreeBSD and sit them down in front of the installer just starting and installing the system and starting the first uses of it, and find the spots where they're running, the rough spots, where they're getting stuck, what the problems they're having are, so we can iron those out. Because it's gotten to the point with the installer for me that I could do it with my eyes closed. Like literally, I've done it on a headless machine. And so it's very difficult for me at this point to know what some of the specific issues are. But there are definitely some rough spots. And, while FreeBSD rightfully takes pride in its documentation, things change so quickly that the documentation is often struggling to keep up. Even the chapter on the installer, I went and did a bunch of work on that after I made all those changes to the installer to add the ZFS mode and so on. But all the screenshots are out of date, and there's like 3 extra options, and some of it's not explained, and there's some new pages at the end with no explanation, and there's a bunch of pieces missing, basically. And no one's had time to go through and put in new screenshots and so on. There are plenty of places for people to get involved and help. You don't have to be a BSD expert to be able to take screenshots of each step of the installer. It's very easy to get started. We need a lot of help with that area. Over the next few years, I hope FreeBSD will continue to lead the way as a storage platform and continue to grow its virtualization and container capabilities. Something I'd really like to see is the FreeBSD answer to Proxmox, which is basically FreeNAS for VMs. And doing that. And I know that FreeNAS is building some capabilities in that area, but I mean a dedicated virtualization appliance. FreeBSD has had strong container technology for longer than anyone else. It was basically invented here. But the lack of the additional tooling and just the final finishing touches to turn that into a real usable product means that, we're getting beaten by Docker out of nowhere, even though, jails are better containers than Docker, but it doesn't have the tooling and the everything around it, and so it's not what people use. So I hope to see more polish in what FreeBSD offers and that last, 20% on a lot of those projects. More things on by default, more stuff working, more stuff easier to use, more stuff exposed, etc.
Yeah. And JT wrote, to dovetail on what Alan Benedict said, for me, both of what they are talking about revolves around a single point, outreach. I really wish FreeBSD's outreach was better. The focus seems to be in the corporate sphere, which is important, but I feel like we were missing out on mindshare of the next generation of technologists. There is so much fear, uncertainty, and doubt spread around the rest of the open source world, or in Linux, that it would really be nice if there's a concerted effort to counter a lot of the false narratives going around. And there are a lot of brilliant people currently working on and developing Linux who have never given FreeBSD or any of the BSDs a chance because of the things they've heard.
Yeah, and I know that JT and other people at the TrueOS and FreeNAS projects and IX in general go to a lot of Linux conferences and try to get that exposure. But I wonder if there's extra things we could do. I almost wonder, it's like we have an XS laptop at the FreeBSD booth at a conference, like a Linux-style conference, and commits users to take the install FreeBSD challenge or whatever, and give us their feedback about what parts of it were difficult for them or whatever, and what parts didn't make sense. And, they get a sticker or something.
Yeah.
Just what we can do to get this exposure to the broader group of people in both ways. Like, obviously, we want more people to know about FreeBSD, but even just collecting their feedback provides value to us, for us to be able to make it more usable. I think the biggest problem with the outreach, like JT is mentioning, is until recently, FreeBSD wasn't very approachable as a desktop, like a personal computer operating system so much. And that was more likely to turn people away from FreeBSD, but I do agree that there's still this old stigma of, oh, FreeBSD, you have to compile everything and there's no packages and nothing works. It's like, well, actually, you know, if you sit a novice or medium Linux user down at a TrueOS box, they probably wouldn't know it wasn't running Linux.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the utilities are all the same, and many of the command line tools are, or commands are
using
there.
Firefox and KDE or whatever. You visually couldn't tell the difference just by looking at it.
Yeah.
So next question. What's most important life lesson you have learned personally and also in relation to technology?
Yeah, so my is a German saying. Here it goes. Es wird nicht so heiß gegessen, wie es gekocht wird, which translates to or means nothing is eaten as hot as it is cooked. This means that many things or things may seem urgent for you, but then they are much less urgent than you think. Many things influence outcomes, so what you know today may change tomorrow, so don't worry too much because tomorrow there may be new insights, variables, facts, things you did not know about that change the game. And it's the same in technology. One thing that's hot tonight or today might tomorrow be outdated because there's something new going around or there's a bug in there that does make it not work the way it is intended. So yeah, don't be too excited for some things. It's keep calm and watch how things develop, and then yeah, you can still jump on the bandwagon then.
Yep. I would say a lot of what I've learned from participating in FreeBSD has been about people and communications and community. I think the most important thing was just that I've got out of it was just understanding how fulfilling it is to create some software or some patch or whatever feature, and that be useful to large numbers of people. That's a really good feeling, and it's nice to know that that's out there to do and have fun doing it. And then, originally I didn't really like traveling. I think technically still I don't like traveling, but I like being at the place with the people for a while. Even if, the flying back and forth part isn't as much fun. But, I used to be exceedingly uncomfortable being away from home for too long. But now I do it all the time and it's fine. It's kind of a group travel fun times.
Yeah. And it's also the method of travel. It's different in economy class than in business.
Well, it's not so much that. It's that's just the pain you suffer to get there. It's about, the reason you do it is because when you get there, it's a group of people, some of who you know, some of who you don't, but you're with the people that speak the same language as you. I think it was my second BSD CAN. So I was invited to the Dev Summit, I think to work on the doc stuff for ZFS. And so I got there a couple days earlier than my business partner. So I was at BSD CAN alone, and I didn't know very many people at all. But I walked over to the pub, and outside on the patio were a bunch of people talking about wear leveling on SSDs. I'm like, these are my people. Can I join you? Pull up a chair. And we had a whole conversation about under-provisioning SSDs to make them last longer and stuff. This is when MLC was very new still.
Yeah, I see.
And that's definitely.
Yeah, JT's answer is never think you can stop learning or that at some point you'll know everything. The moment you stop, you'll be left behind. Yeah, that's certainly true for technology. I mean, it's difficult to keep up.
At the same time, never be like, I'll never understand that. Because, I used to look at C and pointers and be like, I don't understand how that works. And now I'm like, actually, that kind of makes sense now.
Well, it's never too late to learn, yeah.
Yep. So, next question. Which scripting language do you use most often?
So for me, it's shell mostly due to my sysadmin work at the university and the fact that I teach shell scripting to students in my Unix class each week now in a winter term. And I do a lot of YAML scripting recently with my Ansible playbook scripting, so I guess that counts. So I'm doing a lot of automation with Ansible nowadays, and that probably also counts as scripting.
Kind of. It's more of a config file, right?
Yeah, more like that, but
Yeah.
it still has loops and all this. But yeah, it's more like a script or a config file.
My answer is kind of embarrassing. So I write mostly scripts in SH, but also some PHP. I've written a likely excessive amount of command line PHP tools. They just really nice string manipulation bits in there. And at the time, going back 10 years or so, it was just the programming language I was most familiar with. So I could do it a lot quicker in PHP than I could in Shell, even if it should have been done in Shell or in something else. I found PHP a lot less confusing than Perl, much more readable.
Yeah.
It just happened to be what I know best. Nowadays, it's definitely much more towards Shell now that I understand Shell and can do stuff better. But I've definitely become more comfortable with Shell now and do that. And then as I started working on C, I use that a bit, but usually not for small things.
Mm. And JT's answer is, any scripting I do is in Shell, though I'm spending all my time in Qt these days, so sadly I don't get to do much scripting anymore.
So next question, do any of you employ other BSDs like OpenBSD, NetBSD, Dragonfly, etc. for tasks, or do you exclusively use just FreeBSD? Have you, or if you use or have used others, I'd be curious to know what works for you and what does not.
So it's all FreeBSD I'm using here, and macOS if that counts. So on servers it's the BSDs, and yeah, it's macOS on my main laptop here, but I could also switch to another a total FreeBSD laptop if it makes me productive enough. That also works.
Yep. Currently, my private usage is exclusively FreeBSD. For work, we have about 12% of our machines that run CentOS Linux for the live video transcoding, because that requires proprietary drivers and other components that we can't get for FreeBSD today, although we're still nagging people to hopefully make that happen someday.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a little bit with OpenBSD very far in the past, but nothing recent.
And JT answers, other than TrueOS, on a multitude of machines, including a new 8-socket Xeon box I've happened upon, but that's a story for later. He runs OpenSense as his main firewall, but other than that, he does not have any other BSDs in use currently. And we also got a few short tweet questions from Michael Dexter. So the first one is, what's the deal with Michael W. Lucas, or MWL author? So I tweeted in response that, well, the deal with Michael W. Lucas is basically that he writes books, or great books actually. You give him money for it. I hear it's called buying or something like that. So he can write more books, and that's the deal I have with him. Other than that, being a nice guy and having good jokes.
I don't know what the deal with Michael W. Lucas is. I do know if you feed him gelato, it goes better, but that's about all I know.
Yep, and JT writes, some say he isn't machine washable, and all his potted plants are called Steve. All we know is he's called the MW author. Okay.
Yeah. So the next question is about what non-AMD 64 hardware do you actually use?
Yeah, I also tweeted that because I was too quick to answer before I stopped. So I tweeted, I use a Raspberry Pi 3 on FreeBSD to monitor our big data cluster using IXsystems. It's not perfect yet, but it works great so far. I want to add a little bit more plugins to it and make it a little bit more self-sufficient, I guess. And there's a great how-to coming in the future FreeBSD journal, my write-up on how I set that whole thing up. So look out for that one.
Yeah. For me, I have some Onion Omega 1 and 2 devices, and I think one of every type of Raspberry Pi, and NVIDIA Jetson TK1 or whatever. Pretty much don't use any of them, sadly. The Onion Omega 1 I've had working as a fan controller and a temperature probe, and I hope to do more with that and play with it now that I think coming up we're talking about getting the Onion Omega 2 working under FreeBSD, and I'd like to play with that a bit more as well. But they basically rarely get used. So constrained for time, I don't have time for all the hobby projects I'd love to do with the Omega 2 and Omega 2 Plus that I have, and the various Raspberry Pis. One of the things we did at work was try to turn a Raspberry Pi into a video streaming box. But the USB bus was not very fast, and not having dedicated networking was kind of sucky. We might try that again with the Rock 64 once that's working nicely on FreeBSD, because it has real Ethernet and a USB 3 controller, in addition to some USB 2 ports, which might make it just that much better for doing a video streaming appliance. And it's specifically designed to fit in a Raspberry Pi case. It's all the ports are in the same places and so on. So that's interesting.
Okay. JT writes, I have a bunch of other older things. I have a Toshiba Libretto 75 megahertz Pentium Pro. Oh boy, those were the days. That I break out from time to time to play with. As for other x86 hardware, I also still have a Pentium 3 laptop, which I use for web browsing. And it works, so why not? He also writes, I've recently taken possession of an old UltraSpark 3 based Sunfire 280R, but I haven't had time to install Solaris 9 on it yet. I also have a rather large box of ARM-based devices. Lastly, there's a Power 6 mainframe near where I live that I've been tempted to get, but I don't have three-phase 240-volt 60-amp power at my house. So...
yeah. Plus, that'll run up your power bill real quick.
Yeah, this is a big machine, and yeah. Okay, next question.
Yep. So next question is, what's up with the FreeBSD amnesiac stuff? So if you first boot up a VM or something in FreeBSD, you might notice above the login prompt is like FreeBSD blah 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 amnesiac.
Yeah, my answer to that is, good question. I forgot about the answer. Ha!
From the reading of the man page for, I think, rc.conf, it's the hostname that gets assigned if no hostname is set in rc.conf, because the machine has obviously forgotten what its name is.
That's
so if
cheating,
you don't have
yeah.
a hostname set, it defaults to it shows that instead of blank, and so obviously you see that as the default in the installer and in the pre-built VMs. But once you set a host name, when you reboot, it will print the host name there, so that if you have a console server or something, you can flip through them and tell which one's which. Next question. What's keeping you on your Windows or Mac OS machines? Would virtualization fill the gaps?
Yeah, so first, people should use what they're comfortable with. I look here and there at conferences what people are using, and I like some of what I see. So even I did not use Macs all the time. So I switched from various other operating systems and laptops to this one currently. I may switch in the future. Who knows? The point is, what makes you productive does not mean you're suddenly less engaged in BSD.
Yeah,
And
a couple of different answers for me. My first comment is that I find this question to be kind of Linuxy. One of the things I like about BSD is that, people don't care what OS you run; they care what work you do. I'd been a Windows user for basically my whole career. I started with DOS, but very quickly got Windows 3.1 or whatever, and that's what a computer was to me for a long time. So I'm just very comfortable. I know where all the buttons are, and I can do it all. Over the last few years, I have managed to migrate our office. All of our main computers run FreeBSD, or TrueOS, but FreeBSD. So at work, full-time FreeBSD native. We have one Windows machine in the corner that we use for video conferencing and Java software and various things we might need for 5 or 10 minutes at a time. And, especially stuff that doesn't necessarily work well in a VM. Until recently, I had never even tried macOS. I was perfectly happy to just use FreeBSD where I could and so on. But as you might have heard at VBSDCon, I won a 13-inch MacBook Pro. And so I've been experimenting that with a bit. My original plan was I think I've just finished getting my whole life switched to FreeBSD. Mac is just, I don't want to do that too. So the first thing I did was try to run FreeBSD on the Mac, but the keyboard and mouse don't work, so that's not really going to fly. So I have the Mac. I like it for the battery life and the screen. And I'm probably going to play with the ZFS on macOS stuff, just to have played with that and so on. But the Mac is mostly just my travel companion now, because it's much lighter than my old computer. So there's that. The main reason that BSD Now is produced on a Windows computer is the compositing software we use, Wirecast, and the HDMI capture card just aren't going to... There's no drivers for the capture card, and Wirecast doesn't run on FreeBSD. And then Skype, also video and that, not working well on FreeBSD. And just general performance of the video elements. I've had the webcams working under FreeBSD without much trouble, but the frame rate, like when Chris tried to do Skype on FreeBSD for BSD Now back years ago, the problem was he would get about half the frame rate he would get in Windows, and the video would just be blurrier and chuggier. And so we didn't stick with that. And then, for me personally, from time to time, I play some video games. So I have this one Windows computer here, but like I said, at work, native FreeBSD for everything. Not just for me, I even subjected the other people at the office to it. It's pretty good. And because of that, it led to this kind of interesting thing. I've done a bunch of work on FreeBSD, like all the changes to the installer and all the changes for the encryption in the bootloader. Those were all written on my Windows machine. So my NAS has an SVN checkout, export it over Samba, pull it up in my favorite text editor or whatever on my Windows machine, work on it, save it, compile it, run it in a VM or whatever. Don't tell anybody that I wrote all my FreeBSD code on a Windows machine. It just works, and that's all that you should care about.
Yeah.
But, I understand the value of, using FreeBSD every day at work and making sure all of it works and that the web browser performs nicely and so on. It's just, I don't know that we need to be too persnickety about it. I had one other point, but I can't remember it now.
Windows, Mac, something.
Yep, I covered that. Yeah, good enough.
Yeah, okay.
So next, there's... I don't even know what they're referring to here, but apparently there's some files in the source tree under user.sbin/ntp called under my desk. I have no idea.
Yeah, so my guess is it's a similar placeholder as in the amnesia question we had. Seems like a good question for an interview if you know about this. And for what it's worth, I don't dare to look under my desk.
Yeah. Dust and hairballs. I have no idea what that's about.
Okay, and we got some individual questions that only got one of us to answer. So
Although I think I glommed onto a couple of them because I'm like that.
Yeah. No, that's okay. So the first question that this one came from me.
Well, I guess I should ask it for you. What is the first open source task you ever worked on?
So I brought the German FreeBSD FAQ in sync with head, which was over 200 individual commits, and that got me my commit bit for the doc tree and a whole lot of other trouble I'm currently in. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
I think my first attempt to do open source was some patches for something in rc.d for, I think, the fibs, when we first got fibs, to be able to initialize them, although I don't think that ever got accepted. But my first major contribution, obviously, was the ZFS chapter of the FreeBSD handbook. The next one's you.
Right. Sorry. Yeah, this one is for Alan. Did learning how to program help you to become a better sysadmin? And if so, how much? Is it worth it? So talking about real programming, not shell scripting, etc.
Yeah, I would say it definitely improved my ability to understand what is happening on the system. The ability to read the source code of bits of the operating system and make sense of it makes it easier to understand what's happening. I have a better understanding of the various error messages and the crash messages and what that actually might mean, and so on. I've also managed to improve some tools that I use or build new tools and so on, create my own tools. You don't need to be a developer to be a good sysadmin, but having some basic skills can give you an advantage. Even if you can't write C, if you can read enough of it, you can generally understand what's happening. It can make it much more clear how you ended up in this bit of the code where you're running into trouble or whatever. And then I think my last observation of some of the worst sysadmins I've ever met are actually developers who are trying to be sysadmins. I don't know exactly what it is, but a sysadmin can make a great programmer, but a great programmer can't make a good sysadmin.
Yeah, that's why there's this whole DevOps movement probably. Anyway, so this one is for JT and Alan about what software tools and platforms are used in the production of the show and how long does the process take? And JT answered, I do not handle the video editing of the show, so I can't reply to that, but for the show preparation, web browser, Notepad, and Google Docs.
Yeah, for the preparation, it's basically the whole week. We just, as you're browsing the internet or whatever, collecting and bookmarking various links and aggregating those. Then usually on the Monday and Tuesday, we whack that all into a shared Google Doc and write up the show notes and come up with a show that must be finished before we start the show at 2 o'clock. Or in this case, we had to have 2 of them done by the time 1 o'clock came around. Luckily, I did it all. It was all finished before I went to bed last night. So Google Docs is the main platform we use for just sharing the show notes and collaboratively working on those. For the actual production, the frame, like the red you see around the outside here with our names and stuff, that's a program called Wirecast, and it's pulling in video from my camera here, then using software called Desktop Presenter, pulling in the screen from another computer that's way over there. That's where Benedict's video comes from. And then if I'm showing you a website, that's actually coming from a third computer that's actually in the living room, again, over the software. Or actually, sorry, Benedict no longer comes in over software. He comes over an HDMI capture card, but even more complicated. So that composites that all together and does the little transition when we want to show something and you see it goes sloop and then sloop. And that's Wirecast. And then obviously we use Skype as how I bring in Benedict's face and voice, and also the interviewee when we have to do that. And there's that. And then lastly, I checked in with our guy that does video editing, Richard or Rakai in IRC, and he edits the show using Final Cut on OS X.
Okay, the next question is, besides practice, what are the things that helped you learn programming the most? Yeah, that was interesting to me as well.
First, I wouldn't say that I've learned very much yet. Still a very novice C programmer. Most of what I've learned has been from reading code written by others. FreeBSD is kind of great for that because there's an example of how to do almost everything in here somewhere. Although, varying by age, some of them aren't very good examples anymore. Just by reading code others have written and trying to understand it has helped me a lot. The way I got started was I wanted to extend some shell scripts that I had written using this fancy new technology FreeBSD got called UCL, or the Universal Config Language. That is a C library, and so you can't just use it directly from a shell script. So I asked, how hard could it be to write a small C program that just works as an adapter between my shell script and this library, which can then parse the config file? So I found having a specific goal and a very narrow scope just let me iterate and do it and actually accomplish it and feel confident about it. And I found, FreeBSD has man pages for all the libc functions. Super helpful. And a bunch of other things. You don't go write your own doubly linked list implementation. There's this q.h file where it's all done and laid out for you. All the nice things. Yeah. The other thing is, being part of the community and being able to just ask people, how do you do this? Or very specific questions. You can't ask broad questions and expect useful answers. But, yeah. The other thing has been code review. The first set of patches I wrote for new syslog, posting those up and just having Conrad Meyer go over it and point out things to me, or Mariusz Zaborski has been very helpful with that as well, especially with the Geli code, going over it and pointing out things that I might have done wrong or where I might do it differently.
Okay, so there's hope for us still.
Yep. Next question is, viewer asks, they believe that you, Benedict, work at a university and are involved with the administration of a FreeBSD system there. Can you elaborate on that and give some technical details on how it's used in that environment? And does FreeBSD enable your business, or would it otherwise suit your needs just as well? And can you elaborate on that and give some technical details on how it's used in that environment?
Yeah, so yes, I work in a university, which is a University of Applied Sciences, which is more hands-on focused. And I'm not a professor there, not playing one on the internet. And so what I do there is I manage a big data cluster at work. So instead of having a lab where there's computers, I have a rack to manage in the server room, which I never see, or just twice a year or so. And I took over this cluster from a colleague of mine who's still sitting in the same office with me. And he was running it under Ubuntu because that was the distribution he was using and thought would be best for the thing. That's totally okay. So we currently have 48 nodes. So one node has 8 CPUs, 64 gigs of RAM, and 4 1 terabyte hard disks each. And we have one big file server with an extra 19 terabyte storage in a hardware RAID. Oh dear. Yeah. So I'm slowly transitioning it to FreeBSD with ZFS and Beehive. Slowly means that I'm not doing such a big bang and, oh, by the way, I reformatted the whole cluster with FreeBSD and now you have to use this. This is not going to go well. So I'm doing it the slow way, which means that most people, like professors, students, or researchers that are using the cluster, they usually don't care about the OS much. They're just running applications like databases on top of that. So they don't actually care what's running underneath. They just want to run their application. And other users just trust me to do the right thing. So they say, set this database up. I don't care how you do it, just as long as it works. And okay, here I go, giving you a nice ZFS environment without you knowing. And so before that, they were running the applications on the OS disk, while the other 3 disks lay idle. So that's really inefficient if you consider you have 3 more disks you could use. Why not do this? I mean, some disks were used for specific database. So one was used probably for the index, or the other one was used for the actual data. But still, yeah, having them all work together in conjunction is better. So I'm using ZFS to accelerate all these accesses, and the writes are significantly boosted because I configured the pool to be a rate 10, so which is 2 minutes striped. And so I use Beehive there as well. When multiple people, like when we have a lot of students wanting to do a specific class on the cluster and we don't have enough machines, so I create a couple of Beehive machines because these machines have enough power to run multiple Beehives even. And that way they can share the machines, and they can also play around with root and sudo access. I don't have a problem with that. They can wreck their old Beehive as much as they want. And as long as they don't need to do any benchmarking, that's totally fine with me. And so far I have good results, and the file server is my next target for conversion, because having a configuration with that number of disks in a BIOS controlled RAID is kind of not so well. So what this file server does, it exports the home directories via NFS to each node, and because it is that hardware array, I can't even check the disk health via Smart, so I don't even know whether some of the disks are dying or if that thing is healthy, or I don't get any data back. I just see one big chunk of disk. And yeah, I want to have ZFS for that, so I may be able to do this in the next semester holidays, not during the semester. This will not work. And yeah, I will report back if that goes well. And yeah, so why FreeBSD? Because it allows me many things like boot environments and having regular snapshots in the background, which is vital when a lot of students are doing experiments or delete something by accident and they go, can I get that state back from 2 hours ago or from like 5 minutes ago? Sure, no problem. I just roll back. I'm hoping that one day we can do some benchmarks on the cluster with the NoSQL databases running on FreeBSD. And we have a couple of data sets, which is a number of data with scientific purposes that we can use for benchmarks, and maybe write a paper about this at a BSD conferences maybe. So it's an ongoing process, but it's slow and steady. But I'm halfway through of implementing that.
Cool. So our last question is actually directed towards our producer. Do you have any thoughts regarding the differences between FreeBSD and OpenBSD? And the viewer who wrote in the question says, haha, this is just a friendly in-joke reference to the previous producer. Our previous producer, TJ, started as very much a FreeBSD person, but over the course of producing the first 100 episodes or so of BSD Now, got more and more into OpenBSD and eventually went on to become an OpenBSD committer. And didn't have time to continue to do the so we replaced them with JT, our producer, who was a Linux developer and is now a TrueOS developer.
Mm-hmm.
So, you want to read his answer?
Yeah. He writes, I have a great deal of respect for the OpenBSD guys and what they've been able to accomplish. My opinion comes down to use case. If I need an ultra-secure server in a hostile field of operations, I'll choose OpenBSD. If I need a server to be up and stable for as long as humanly possible, I'll choose FreeBSD. And that's been the interview questions we had for this section or for this episode. Don't worry, there's much more coming, and you can still send further questions to us at feedback@bsdnow.tv, and we'll cover it in a future show.
Yep. We'll be doing another one of these next week, but it'll come out 2 weeks after this one. So if you're watching live, it'll be next week. If you're watching this when it comes out, which will be later, then it'll be 2 weeks from now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so hope you like these questions and our answers, of course. And yeah, keep sending more. So we hope you liked our interview questions for ourselves this week. Going next into our news roundup for this week, which is the first item has building FreeBSD for the Onion Omega 2. This is a tutorial style.
So this is an Onion Omega 2. It's really, not much bigger than my thumb. And you can run FreeBSD on it. It's a little MediaTek MIPS board. So there's a little tutorial here on how to use it with the FreeBSD Wi-Fi build framework. So a couple of extra settings to make your build small enough and build it without clang. And then you're on the road. So the first step after the config files is the device tree source files. Those are not upstreamed into FreeBSD yet, so they get fetched here from somebody else's repo on GitHub. And then maybe some kernel configuration, you make some small changes, and then you can run the build script for the RA link when you want to build world, kernel, install them, and distribute using that DTS file and the specific kernel config for the flattened device tree. And once that's done, you will have an output image ready to be TFTP booted. Or you can convert that into a regular binary, LZMA compress it, and then combine it with U-boot to actually make a bootable image. And now you have a U-boot image, and that can be copied to a USB device and plugged in. So then it says, if you hold the reset button while you have the console open to boot it up, then you'll be able to press 1 on the command line and drop into the shell here, reset the USB, and read the kernel off the fat formatted USB stick and boot it. And then you will see the Onion Omega come up.
Yep, they provide the full boot log here.
Yep.
Until the login prompt.
And we'll start the command prompt and reset it and boot FreeBSD. And then FreeBSD starts up. Then they provide instructions on how to use the MFS root and fsimage commands to actually make a base system and put those on a USB stick so that you can actually have a whole user lane to run. And mounting those at the mount root prompt. And then it comes up and you get your familiar FreeBSD login page. So there's still a bit of work to be done here to clean this up and make it so that you could maybe make it persistent so that it lived on the device so it could just boot by itself. And maybe, Pixie booting the device would be nice to as a way to start it up and then write it to the flash like I did on the Onion Omega 1. But in general, it's all pretty interesting. So now that you can run FreeBSD on this, I'm going to have to find time to play with it some more. Although, time seems to be the hardest thing to find.
Yeah. But maybe there's a weekend coming up where you don't have any plans.
Nope.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not even going to be home most of the weekends coming up, so.
Yeah, right. You have different things to do.
All right. Next, we have our sponsor, DigitalOcean. If you head over to DigitalOcean, you can get started. We're going to talk a little bit of different stuff about them this week, and how it works for business in particular. Some of the different things you can do. So the most powerful feature of DigitalOcean for our business was Teams, where we could create a team and invite multiple people to use it so that, everybody on the team doesn't have access to, say, our corporate credit card, but they have access to create and destroy VMs as needed and whatever other permissions I give them. It's very helpful that way. Some of the other things you can do with DigitalOcean are developer tools, right? DigitalOcean was originally designed specifically for developers. So, testing, continuous integration, continuous deployment, monitoring, all that kind of stuff. It's super easy to get started that way. Especially CI type things. If you want to kick off a build every time somebody commits something, if their small VMs are 0.7 of a cent per hour and your build only takes a little while, you can just fire up one, have it build, grab the results, and then delete the VM, and you spent less than a penny, but you build tested everything. And, at times when there are many commits, then they can each happen individually, and then when it's quiet, nothing happens. Works very nicely. Or, monitoring. It's like, we need to monitor, and we want to do that from outside of our network so we can check our observability and make sure that we're visible to the internet and so on. It's like, well, $5 a month is not very expensive to have an external monitoring site. But also data processing, right? If you need batch and real-time computational workloads or web applications or whatever, especially with their floating IP feature, where you need to be able to have your application running, install the updated version of the application in like a blue-green type setup, migrate traffic over to the new one. If it works, great. If it doesn't, you quickly migrate the IP back and then fix your new environment and then try it again until you can successfully upgrade. It just makes it that much easier.
Yeah, so the DigitalOcean folks have all the nice GUIs prepared for you and makes it very easy to get started, and also growing with the demands, like you need more CPU power or more memory, and you can all configure this while you're still running on one of the machines or multiple even.
Yeah. And, they have the load balancers and high availability and floating IPs. They have different droplet types now where you can get high CPU or high memory or just the regular ones. With the block storage and object storage and replication, all those problems are taken care of. They have multiple locations, private networking, support for everything, a great API, command line tools, 4 nines, global availability, lots of regions, good bandwidth, and premium support. It's pretty hard to find a fault. So head over to DigitalOcean.com, sign up. You can spin up a FreeBSD instance in only 55 seconds. And if you use the coupon code FreeBSD Now, you get an extra $10 added to your account. Pretty hard to complain.
Yeah, that's how I started with it, and I'm a very happy customer now.
Yep. So next up.
Yeah.
This is
this one. Yeah, is cool. So it deals with setting the CPU affinity on FreeBSD jails with EasyJail.
Yeah. So while there's more advanced resource control features available for FreeBSD jails called RCTL, one of the most basic ways to control CPU usage is to limit which CPUs each jail can use. This can make sure that every jail has access to some dedicated resources while at the same time sharing other resources, and make sure that any one jail can't necessarily dominate the machine. So the tutorial goes on. I just got a new home server, an HP ProLand ML110 G6. Being a FreeBSD person, it was natural to just use that on my server instead of Linux. I chose to use EasyJail to manage the jails on the ProLand, with the initial one being a Tor middle node. Despite the fact that where this machine is hosted, the upstream is only 35 megabits, which is pretty good for cable, I didn't want to give Tor access to all of the cores. Right? This is a service you're providing for free to people. You can only have some of my resources. So by setting the CPU affinity, it would let you choose a specific CPU core or a range of cores or a list of cores that you want it to be able to use. However, currently it doesn't let you choose just a number of CPU cores that you want and have the scheduler pick. That one in general probably doesn't make sense anyway. With RCTL, you can set percentage limits, like this can only have 25% of the CPU or whatever. Going forward, I assume that you have already created a jail using EasyJail admin, and also do not cover limiting jails to certain percentages of CPU and so on, like with RCTL. So it's quite easy with EasyJail. You just use EasyJail config -C and then the core number, or a range, so like 0 through 3 will cover the first 4 cores, or a list like 2, 5 will only give it the core number 2 and 5, which are the third and sixth core, but whatever. And then the jail name, and it's set. Now, when that jail starts, it will be limited to that subset of CPUs.
Yep, especially if you're running multiple CPUs or jails on those. Multiprocessors nowadays might come in handy.
Yeah, they say. And hopefully you should have your EasyJail managed FreeBSD jails limited to the CPU cores you want. While I did not cover CPU percentage or RAM usage, those can be done with the RCTL tool, and you can look that up on the man page if you're interested. It'd be good to get handbook guides written about that, though. So if somebody is using that or reads about it and starts using it, it'd be great to write that up. Mm-hmm. They say, I'll admit it doesn't really matter which CPUs a jail runs on, but it might matter if you want a jail to have access to all the CPU cores available and only want a specific jail to have only one core or something. Since it's not really possible to just specify the number of cores, a fallback would be use the CPU affinity, which requires you to pick individual CPU cores, but it allows you to limit them to a subset. I know it's not the best solution, but it works. So yes, at work, we actually use this on high core count machines. There's one machine that has 3 different databases running on it, each on separate mirrored pools of SSDs. But we want to make sure that no one of them can use all the CPU time and kind of starve out the others. So the first 2 cores on the machine are actually reserved for the host machine. Then the second 2 are for the first database, and the next 2 for the next database, and the next 2 for the third database. And then all 3 databases and the host machine have access to the rest of the cores. So they all share some cores, so that each one has access to lots of cores so that it won't be starved. But each one is guaranteed these 2 cores nobody else is going to be using, and they're available to you.
Very nice.
So, each jail gets a couple cores to itself and some shared cores to make sure it has all the, we don't want the CPUs being idle because, if this jail is using the max number of CPUs it's allowed and the rest aren't, having too much idle is a waste. But you want to make sure that one can't completely dominate the others as well. So it's quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that we have, or what might people find interesting, is a practical guide to containers on FreeNAS for a depraved psychopath. So if you're interested in playing with Docker, this guide sets up a Linux VM running on FreeBSD or FreeNAS under Beehive, then runs Linux Docker containers on top of that. You know that jails are dope, and I know that jails are dope, yet no one else knows it. So there we're stuck with Docker. So 2 years ago, I would be the last person to recommend using Docker, but a while ago of things that has changed past years. So this tutorial uses IOHive to manage the VMs on the FreeBSD or FreeNAS, so people can follow that here. And the guide starts with, there are many Linux variants you can choose from, Rancher OS, Core OS as the most popular for Docker-only hosts. We're going to use Rancher OS because it's more lightweight out of the box. So it describes how you go to the Rancher OS website and get a couple of packages to fetch, and you're using IOHive to fetch the releases and the ISO basically, and then you install a couple of packages, and basically then you create the Rancher 32 gigabytes virtual machine. Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
and
it's a 32 gigabyte disk image.
That's the disk image. Okay. Yeah, then you define which loader to use. Beehive, of course. It should have 8 gigabyte RAM and 8 CPUs. And how you connect to this thing with a null modem cable and the operating.
So it's for the console.
Oh yeah, for the console to interact with. And then you install this thing and you connect to the console. Then the tutorial does some basic configuration of Rancher OS and some housekeeping in IOHive to make Rancher OS come up unattended at boot. So the whole point of this guide is to reduce the pain, and using the Docker CLI is still painful. There are a lot of web UIs to control Docker. Most of them include a lot of orchestration services, so it's just overkill. Portainer is very lightweight, can be run even on a Raspberry Pi. Create a config file as described in the guide, And after the reboot, you will be able to access the web UI on port 9000. The setup is very easy, so the guide doesn't go over it. And the description we have here, we close with the Docker tools of FreeBSD are still being worked on. There's a guide on the FreeBSD wiki if you want to check that out. Eventually, you will be able to host native FreeBSD Docker containers on FreeBSD jails, but we're not quite there yet. So in the meantime, you can install sysutils/docker and use it to manage the Docker instances running on a remote machine, or in this case, the Rancher OS virtual machine running in Beehive.
Yeah, so there's extra instructions in the tutorial here for enabling the remote API so that you can control the Docker instance remotely, and how to set up NFS so that you can share files into the VM that's hosting the Dockers, and also, how to set your time zone. Or, as they recommend, use UTC everywhere and don't do time zones. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Yeah, nice guide. Try it out for yourself and report back if you find something, or if you're using this in production maybe. So, time for our Beastie Bits this week. The first one is The Ghost of Invention, a visit to Bell Labs, excerpt from the forthcoming book Kitten Clone, Inside Alcatel-Lucent.
Yes, in case you don't remember, Bell Labs is where Unix was invented, and this is an excerpt from a book about the company that bought Bell Labs later, but is a modern-day visit to what Bell Labs is today, and some talks about that. It's interesting if you're into the history and stuff.
Pictures. There are pictures.
Yep. Pictures of a bunch of different things and what it looks like there, and some talk. Quite a bit of stuff. Lots of history and stuff. It's definitely worth reading if you're interested in the history at all. I would prefer if the author didn't quite take this stance so that, these people are so smart you can't understand what they're saying. He seems to give up without trying to understand instead of trying to understand. But anyway, there's lots of content, a bunch of pictures and stuff. It's definitely worth the short read. Well, it's a medium-sized read, but it's definitely interesting to see how different things are today and how much it's not all that different.
All right. The next one is OpenBSD Cookbook, which is a set of Ansible playbooks. So the description over at GitHub is, this is an OpenBSD cookbook. It consists from a set of Ansible playbooks allowing to set up OpenBSD for different use cases, like, for example, development or a workstation or for regression testing. And there's also a screencast for you to check out. And this is certainly something for people who are using Ansible and want to create a quick OpenBSD box with that. That's a good collection of scripts and playbooks.
Yep. This next one I found quite interesting. It's 15 useful sockstat command examples for FreeBSD.
Oh, excellent.
Apparently they actually have one here for netstat as well, but I don't know if that's for FreeBSD. But sockstat basically is a different formatted output than netstat, and it's showing all the listening sockets, which user, which process they are, the PID, file descriptor number, etc. But you can filter that quite a bit. So if you do the -L, it only shows listening sockets, so servers waiting for connections. Or you can do -4 or -6 to look at v4 and v6 only. Or you can say, I only want TCP ports. I don't want to see the Unix sockets and UDP and so on. Or you can choose UDP and so on, or a comma separated list. Or you can do -P and only look at certain ports. So, on some of our machines where we have quite a few different jails, I want to see everything listening on all the various port IDs on the different IP addresses. Or you can do -C to only see connected sockets.
This is certainly useful.
bunch of other things and just kind of showing how you can combine them all, how you can do Unix pipes with -u, or how you can just find everything that involves Nginx and so on. All the different examples on how to do that. And then they even add some awk magic with sort and unique in order to get a list of, which IP address is connected to me the most times. It's actually missing a sort before the unique. They actually missed that, but there's a bunch of different examples of how to do that kind of stuff here. Quite useful.
Good. We also have a prehistory of /. So this is, of course, from Commander Taco, also known as Rob Malda. He has a prehistory of /. On its 20th birthday. So, yeah, congratulations. He ran /. for 14 years as best he could, he writes. Or at least that's his username description here. And it's a nice write-up of, going back in history with the Wayback Machine to the old days of /. And how it looked like. And there's certainly some history there, some backstories, how /. got started and how he kept it running for so long. We thought this might be interesting to a couple of people.
Mm-hmm. And if you are really hardcore, then we have using ed, the Unix line editor. So if you don't know, ed is an editing program where you edit one line of text at a time. It's basically designed to be used over an actual terminal where lines are printed on paper, or over serial and really slow connections. It can be very helpful where you don't want to have to reprint the whole screen every time you scroll down the line and things like that. Mm-hmm. But if you want to be a real Unix ninja, you need to know how to use ed. So you can check out this article.
So, we hope you got something out of our Beastie Bits this week.
Yeah, and if you don't want to have to use ed to try to get your files back, you're going to want to back them up with tarsnap.
Yeah, the proper way to put these backups into the cloud where there's a lot of storage, but there's no one capable grabbing it from the cloud to decrypt it except you, because you're the only person holding the de-encryption key.
Yes, well, basically with the cloud, you have to assume that everybody can have what's in the cloud, and that's why it needs to be encrypted, and the encryption key needs to not be in the cloud. And that's how tarsnap works. It reads the files you ask it to, it then segments those and deduplicates them and compresses them, and then it encrypts and signs those and sends them off to the cloud. The encryption key never leaves your machine. You need to back that up some other way, usually physically, like print it out on paper and put it in a safety deposit box or something, because anybody with that key can read your files, but anyone without that key cannot. And you don't have to take our word for it. You can go read the source code for the tarsnap client and be sure of exactly what it's doing.
Yeah, they also have a bug bounty for small things like typos, or even big ones that are, interfering with tarsnap or something. So if you find something in the source code that shouldn't be the way it should be, then you can submit this to the author of tarsnap, Colin Percival, and figure out, hopefully, that you might get something out of it. But the code has been looked at by many people, and he's pretty sure that there's nothing serious in it.
Yep, but it's there for you to look at and play with. And during betas before new releases, the bug bounties are all doubled. So do make sure to take a look. Yeah,
okay. So feedback and questions. The first one is from Malcolm about ZFS snapshots. It starts with snapshotting and backing up my home directory to another machine with ZFS, as one does. As I understand it, the suggested best practice for SSH private keys is that they should not leave the host they were created in. Yes, but in the setup I have now, they do, and currently my home directory had no encryption. What is the best practice, he asks, around this? It's just my home machine, so I'm not too worried a hacker is targeting me, but this is an enterprise setup I would be. As I understand it, there are some features coming down the pike in ZFS that will help, like the sensitive data removal feature and maybe encryption. Thanks for the great show.
I'd say the first thing is to make sure that you actually have a passphrase on your SSH key, your private key. And then technically it is individually encrypted. So even if the whole file system's not, that file is by the SSH stuff itself.
But why would the private key leave his machine?
Well, it's because he's backing it up to another machine, right? He's replicating the whole home directory.
I thought I thought the path that he was creating between the backup machine and the machine being backed up is transferring the private key somewhere else. That's not,
No, it's not as part of the replication setup. It's the fact that the copy that he's replicating has a copy of the key. So in general, if you make sure that the ZFS replication happens over SSH or SSL or something, so it's encrypted, and then, yes, you should have a passphrase on the private key if you can. Although I'm guessing in this case, he's trying to run it an automatic backup or whatever, so he's using a key with no passphrase. My recommendation there was to have a separate key for the backup. In particular, you can use the ZFS allow command to create a new user called backup or something that can ZFS send and maybe snapshot your home directory, but nothing else, and replicate it to the other machine. And even on that side, again, a separate user without root access to do all these things. And then the key that's being used in an automated fashion is not isn't used for anything except for taking these backups.
Mm. Yeah, it's described in the ZFS mastery books, in this advanced ZFS.
The only other real option is to have your key file live somewhere else and configure that with your ZFS.conf or something. But I don't think it's worth it. You want your private key backed up, probably.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I mean, people are doing snapshots.
Currently, it's not possible to exclude a file from a ZFS snapshot because snapshots are actually block level and they don't know anything about files. Mm. But yes, when the encryption feature lands, maybe that'll solve that.
Yeah. Good. So thanks for the question, Malcolm. Next one is from Darren about zones. He writes, gentlemen, last episode, when asked about what features from other OSs he'd like to see in FreeBSD, Alan mentioned Illumos zones. I'm curious about what the disparity between zones and jails currently is. I was under the impression that they were very similar. Can you elaborate?
So zones were based on jails, but then extended. They're just much more polished as far as what they call crossbow, their virtual networking stuff. vImage is almost working now, but even when it's finished, it's not quite the same as what they did on Solaris. They turned it into a product, and it's just the tools around it are better and nicer and so on. And it'd be really nice for FreeBSD jails to get to that point.
Mm-hmm. Also, do you feel that there are great opportunities for collaboration between the Illumos project and the BSDs? While there are analogues between zones, branded zones, KVM, and Crossbow in jails, the Linuxolator, bhyve, and vImage, my largely uninformed impression is that the Illumos SmartOS specifically technologies are a little more mature.
It does help to have a company paying you to work on it instead of just your free time. With free time, it gets to be good enough for what I need it for, and it's available to you, but, you have to write your own tools or whatever. There is some collaboration happening between Illumos and FreeBSD, especially on kind of things that neither project really wants to do, like the UTF-8 stuff and the locales. But then also, obviously, things like ZFS and dtrace. Now those have the OpenZFS and OpenDtrace projects to try to continue those and commonize it and keep so that dtrace is dtrace on all the platforms and they're all up to date and so on. And yes, I'd like to see more stuff going back and forth in both directions between Illumos and FreeBSD.
Hmm? Yeah, and I think that's totally possible. I mean, there's a good working collaboration between the two.
Yeah, I've definitely seen Illumos people taking interest in various FreeBSD technologies, including recently, I guess a year and some ago, Thomas Soom ported the FreeBSD bootloader over to Illumos to replace their ancient version of Grub. And that's the default now.
Yeah, so there's a collaboration definitely happening between the projects. All right. Mohammed is our last question this week about SSH keys. He writes, "Hello guys, and thank you again for all the wonderful work you do." Oh, sure. I've been a BSD user on a server for 10 years now and never looked back. But for my desktop, I'm still on Windows because of the apps I need. One feature I absolutely love is my SSH client. IXshell is that it managed to get my SSH key onto the server I'm logged into, which enables me to use the same key stored on my laptop to log into another server. This is useful because some clients only allow me to log in from a single IP. So I have a server which I SSH to and then SSH from to the other servers. Any idea how that is done, and if possible, do it on a Mac or a TrueOS desktop? Thanks again, and keep up the great work.
I think that's called SSH agent forwarding. And I know that's generally not necessarily a good thing, but yes, it is possible.
Yeah, it's described probably in Michael W. Lucas' book, SSH Mastery.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, generally it's... so the SSH agent is basically, instead of having to type your password for your key and every time you use the key, you can use SSH agent and then load the key. And then when your SSH client asks your agent, hey, I need the key to log into this machine, it'll get the information it needs. And then with agent forwarding, you can move that so that, when you're SSHing from the second machine to the third machine, the request can be passed to the first machine to get your private key. The downside is that if the second machine is compromised, it could trick things into stealing the key, and you probably don't want that. But if you trust the machines, it's maybe okay. But yes, you probably want to look at SSH agent forwarding. And like Benedict said, best source for this kind of question, the answer to this type of question, is the SSH Mastery book. All right.
Yeah, okay. That's
another whole episode.
Yep. Again, send us anything that you have, comments, questions, show ideas to feedback@bsdnow.tv.
Yes. Story suggestions. We have to do multiple episodes again, so we need more content. There's always lots going on every week, but there's not always 2 weeks worth of stuff every single week. So do send us anything interesting you know about.
Yep, and see you next week.